Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado, welcome to the next PacMam podcast. We are doing a marine mammal highlight this week. I'm Cindy.
I'm Kat.
And I'm Trevor.
And this week, the Minke finally won. The Minke's been part of the poll for the last 3 times, I think, and it's come close to winning, but then something else edged out. But this week it won, so we're very happy to be able to be doing the Minke whale. So that's fun. It's going to be a good one. I think Trevor's going to start us off with some basic information background and the confusion of taxonomy.
Yeah. So Minke whale is one of the species that we have here in the Puget Sound and Salish Sea waters. And it's one of the 2 species that exist as Minke whales. So we have the northern Minke whale, or the common, versus the southern Minke whale, or the Antarctic Minke whale.
Right.
And I can go through the nitty-gritty differences between the 2, but the main difference is their range. So the northern is only found basically northern hemisphere and up, or equator and north, I should say.
Right.
And southern Minke is equator and south, and there's a little bit of overlap between
right, because they're like a they're strange in that they're in almost all waters, like from Antarctic to equatorial.
Right.
Interesting.
But more so, when I was looking at the common Minke, for example, I was looking at just the northern and southern range. It seems like it's pretty, all along the North American coast, you can be found, but on the Atlantic side, it's weird if you find it south of New Jersey.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, we would never see anything down by Florida. Yeah, that's true. Interesting.
So, they have found them in the Gulf of Mexico as vagrants, but
some weird guys that lost their way.
Right.
Right. I'm looking for some worm climbs.
Right.
Interesting.
Huh.
And so I guess the one weird thing about the northern Minke is there is a dwarf form, which I believe is a subspecies.
Yeah, I think I read that it's not a full species yet. They just
I couldn't find a definitive yes, this is a subspecies, but
yeah.
I think Noah might have said that, so I'll believe.
Yeah, I think I read it in 2 different places. So I think it definitely is a subspecies. They're just not sure if it should be a full-on species.
Okay. Well, the dwarf species is not found in the northern hemisphere, which is odd to me, as the northern Minke dwarf form is not found in the northern hemisphere.
That is weird. Why isn't it the Antarctic dwarf Minke?
It's technically the same, genetics would make it the same species, I guess, versus the southern.
Interesting.
But it's found in on Australia and those waters down south.
Interesting. And dwarf just means it's just basically a smaller version of the Minke.
Pretty much, which I'll go through those little nitty-gritty stuff here. The northern Minke, which we find around here, gets to around 30 feet long and 20,000 pounds. And that makes them the 2nd smallest baleen whale in the world. With the smallest being the pygmy right whale.
Oh.
Not by much.
Those little pygmy guys.
But it does make it the smallest rorqual in the world.
Okay, that's what it was, right?
Yeah.
And rorqual, for just a reminder for everybody, rorqual is the ones that have the grooves in the throat that can expand like an accordion.
Okay. The southern Minke, on the other hand, is 35 feet long and 22,000 pounds ish. So just basically the same, but a little bigger.
A little bit, yeah.
Which makes them the 3rd smallest baleen whale.
They're just racking up the lower end.
Right. And then you got the dwarf form of the northern Minke, which is just basically the same thing, but just a little smaller. It's hard to distinguish between the southern Minke as well.
Right. Well, because how big do they get again?
The southern will get up to 35.
And what about the dwarf?
The dwarf will get to 26.
Okay.
So when you're in the field, you might not instantly recognize.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
problem with anything with size. Like sometimes it's like, oh wow, okay, that's a male and that's a female. But when it's
Right.
when
Right.
that, I mean, like with porpoises, yeah, females a little bit bigger than harbor porpoises. Females a little bit bigger than males, but it's inches, so you're not going to notice that. And if you're talking about a 30-foot animal, really a 30-foot versus 35-foot, you're not going to be like, oh, that one was only 5 feet smaller than that one.
Right.
It's just not something you're going to notice.
Right. And there is some difference in their coloration and baleen, actually. So
Oh yeah, I didn't know.
the northern minke, or common minke, has 230 to 360 baleen plates with 50 to 70 throatal pleats, which is basically those lines on the throat that it can expand when they gulp or gulp
feeding. Yeah.
And then the southern has a little less on average with 200 to 300 baleen plates. And I think it was less throatal pleats. 22 to 38 throatal pleats.
What I find interesting is that there's the range within the one subspecies or whatever is so large. Like individuals have 200 to 300 baleen plates. That seems like it's a large range to have for
I guess, but
it's like it would be like, oh well, humans have 20 to 40 teeth. Like that's it's not normal.
They're colored different too. So the north, they're white or cream colored baleen, versus in the south they have, I think it was black colored baleen in the back, like towards the throat, and then white colored in the front.
Oh.
So I guess if you could look at the two species, that's be the biggest difference. I guess you could say.
Evolutionary reason for that?
I have no idea.
That's so interesting.
And then the dwarf northern has like a black line on their baleen. With the southern minke too, there is asymmetry in the coloration of their baleen too.
Ooh.
There is less white on the left side of the mouth of the baleen plates than there is on the right.
Weird.
That's so weird. Like, why?
I think, doesn't the fin whale have something like that too? Not baleen wise, but I think coloration on one side of their body is different than the other.
Yeah, I guess I could see the coloration on the outsides being more normal than like, why would their baleen color change?
Persistent or what? But
I mean, the only thing I could think with the baleen is that when they're doing the gulp feeding, if maybe the color somehow is more camouflaged for the type of prey that they're feeding on, so that the fish are less likely to scatter when they come up beneath them. If they're like, but I have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's the only thing that I could think of with the baleen as to why that might be like advantageous. But
right. I mean, it's possible something's it's not advantageous at all. It just happens to be, and there's no selection against it, so it continues in the population.
True.
But I don't know. It's
crazy.
Interesting.
See, aren't you guys glad that you finally picked the minke?
So cool. I found a lot more than I really thought I was going to about the minke. It's pretty cool.
I guess I haven't really talked about what they look like externally. I can do that part too. So I gave you the sizes, but if you are out in the field and you think you see one, what I imagine, if you know what a harbor porpoise looks like, to me, they just look like giant harbor porpoises.
And that I equate them behaviorally too. We'll talk about that. They're very similar to porpoises in that way.
So like I said, 30 feet-ish in length, but they have a really curved dorsal fin that's pretty tiny, about 2/3 down the body. And they're generally all gray with little patches of white kind of scattered throughout their body. And with generally a white patch on their pectoral fins.
Yeah, something like that. There's like that part. Isn't that for the northern, for the one that we have?
They all have the white patch. It's just pronounced differently based on region.
Okay, because I remember reading like ours, like that's one of the big things you notice is you can see that it's very stark, the white patch up here.
The dwarf minke, I think they said, had the most obvious like band of white, versus the other species, or north versus south.
Right.
So it might spread out more. It might not be as stark, but they all have the white. And then they're very clearly camera shaded, dark on top, white on bottom, and then some white streaks on the sides sometimes.
And so what's interesting about that too is that's how they ID these animals individually. And so it was actually interesting when I first started coming out here trying to do the harbor porpoises and thinking about doing pigmentation patterns. I actually went to a conference and heard Jared Towers talk, who does a lot of research up in Canada. And he was talking about minkies and using the coloration pattern. So I went up afterwards and I was like, oh, can you do that? Does it work? Okay, because I want to try this with porpoises.
Be awesome.
So it's neat that they use the scarring and the coloration patterns on the side to be able to ID the individuals.
I did see the southern minke whale. They have 2 white streaks coming from the blowhole as well.
Ooh, that's cool.
Which
Isn't
is
it
going to be far more prominent than the north. So that's another easy identifier between the two.
Interesting.
I mean, I guess the biggest identifier would just be where you are in the world too. I mean, unless you're in that little band of overlap, it's probably going to be, you're most likely going to know what you're looking at, which is helpful.
Right.
Yeah. You're not going to be like, I'm up here and I saw a southern. No, you did not.
Well, I guess, I mean, the dwarf minke technically is a northern minke species.
True.
So there is overlap there. And they do overlap a little bit at the equator, which I don't know if, Kat, you're going to talk about it, but I think there's 2 accounts of hybrids that they found between the north and south.
I actually wasn't going to talk about that, but
also that goes to like
it.
hybrids. Is it a hybrid if they're still technically the same species?
Well, it was a northern minke mating with a southern minke.
I know, but they're still technically the same species. So a hybrid is technically between two different species.
They're 2 distinct species, the north and south are.
I thought they were just subspecies.
The dwarf is a subspecies.
Oh, okay.
Of the north.
Gotcha.
But the north in general is a different species than the south.
Okay. Bueno.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the 2 hybrids that they found were due to whaling when they caught them. And I think one of the hybrids was pregnant, so they're able to.
Oh, yeah. Well, it makes sense. I mean, they're not a whole. They're not really that different.
So which way round was the hybridization? Did it say as to which one was the female and the male?
I think it was both. I'll have to check on that, but.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't think that there would really be that much difference, either behaviorally or physically, that it would make one be always the male and the other one always the female.
Right.
As we see in harbor porpoises and Dall's porpoises.
Right. Or the blue and fin whale hybrid too. That's a size issue typically. So
yeah.
I believe they're in the Pacific with the Japanese whaling ships that caught them, which makes more sense because there's way more crossover in the Pacific than Atlantic.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and what's interesting too, I noted that they said that the minke actually may have benefited from whaling, which is really weird because you wouldn't think of that, but because they basically the minkies were like, oh, they're too small, they're not worth the trouble, so they didn't whale them until more modern times. But so they took out all the bigger whales, which they all eat very similar things. So you basically reduce the competition for these animals and you increase the prey that they had because those other guys weren't eating it. And so they may have actually done a little bit better until they then decided to start whaling them as well.
I'll talk about it in my section a little bit more.
Good. But it's an interesting, I never would have thought that a whale species would have possibly benefited from whaling in an odd way. So interesting.
Well, that's my descriptive factors of those guys. If you want to move on, Cindy.
All right, diet and behavior. Here we go. So I'm going to start off with my favorite thing about these guys. I learned this a few years ago from some whale watching friends. They have a nickname, and it's a very fun one. So if you've ever smelled a cetacean's breath, which I know many of you probably have not, but if you had, they all smell bad, right? It's very fishy, and it's not a good smell at all. But these guys have such odor in their breath that you can actually smell them sometimes before you see them if you're upwind or downwind. I guess you're downwind. And so they're called stinky minkies, which I just think
little minkies.
Poor minkies. They got like super bad halitosis. Very bad breath.
Do they know why? Is there any kind of like hypothesis as to why theirs is specifically so bad?
I haven't seen anything. They just say like they have really bad breath, and it's
I mean, I'm not sure how you would study that necessarily, but
well, and I guess with all the things, there's a lot we don't know about these guys, so that's probably low on the list as to like why, even though I would think would be really interesting, but it would be difficult to catch their breath and then analyze the chemicals and then catch other breath and analyze those chemicals and see why there's difference. But because they're eating the same things as the larger baleen.
Right. Well, that's why I was wondering if they just have like a different bacterial makeup or I don't know. No, just wondering.
They have some really stinky bacteria that releases a chemical. So They are stinky minkies, but they're so cute. So they are, as I said before, very similar to harbor porpoises in that they are loners for the most part. We see them alone or in small groups of 2 to 3. Occasionally, you'll see aggregations of up to 400 individuals, but those are normally near the poles, near the pole, where you have where the food is really good and really abundant. So these guys are like harbor porpoises in that they are inconspicuous at the surface. They're not flashy. They don't do crazy things. You'll occasionally see them breach. And one place said that like they breach all the time, and I was like, I don't think that's true. And most every other thing I looked at said what we see here, where you don't see them breach very much. They are very low to the surface and hard to see. I think maybe there's some differences in populations. Perhaps there's some really playful minkies out there that in a particular place that like to do that.
Well, it might depend on what context you're seeing them into.
Right. Yeah. So they are these hard to see sometimes at the surface, why they're very easy to miss because they are very sleek and they just what's interesting is when they surface though is that they actually come up rostrum first, or their nose. So most whale species, you don't see their face come out of the water most of the time. But these guys actually come up with their nose kind of pop out of the water, and then they go down, which is interesting. When they surface, they have, I love it, a bushy, small, or weak blow. I guess it's just not as strong. 6.5 to 10 feet high, but I guess that's not super strong. But again, it's very smelly, so it makes up for it in that way. They don't, when they surface too, they don't, like other work walls will oftentimes when they dive, they'll come up and then they fluke up, which means their fluke comes up all the way up out of the water and then they dive down. But these guys don't really do that at all. And so they expose a lot of their back and body in a really high roll sometimes when they dive. So that's why, again, they use that instead of their tail flukes like they do for other species to identify, because we don't see their flukes ever. And I don't know actually if they'd have coloration on there. I don't think they would like humpbacks do.
Oh, good point.
I think in the South they had more coloration on some of their fluke, but
okay. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it's good that they do that higher arch and we get more of their body and you can see more of the pigmentation. Again, like we do with harbor porpoises, we love it when they come up a little bit higher out of the water and we can see that. So when they feed, they again feed on a lot of the other things like the larger whales do, but they oftentimes do what's called a side lunge. So they'll come up on the side of their bodies and come up and lunge out of the water and gulp, like gulp feeding. So they take in all the water, all the fish, their throat grooves expand, and then they push the water out through the baleen and then catch all the stuff inside. They aren't picky. They are opportunistic. They'll eat crustaceans. Wow. That's a new word. It's
Love
like a
it.
crustacean that's playing a percussion instrument. A crustacean.
That's awesome.
Crustaceans, plankton, and small schooling fish. And so things like anchovies, capelin, cod, eels, herring, mackerel, salmon, even sand lance, sari, which is another little bait fish. I looked that one up. Wolffish, pilchard. So they'll often eat krill. Those are mainly the Antarctic guys. But then they also eat coalfish. And if you remember coalfish, that's harking back to our sei whale episode. That's pollock. And that's why sei whales are called sei whales, because it's Norwegian for pollock. And this one surprised me, dogfish.
Huh.
And dogfish are little sharks.
Interesting. Well, they're also not very small, so.
Well, they're not bait fish small, but they're like a foot, maybe something like that. So I've never heard of any cetacean eating a dogfish before.
Huh.
So, and you
not a baleen whale.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, but yeah, I suppose
killer whales do.
I could see a toothed whale.
Yeah, and I think some bottlenose dolphins have learned how to kill like rays and stuff as well. But
yeah, the different ones.
Yeah.
So I only know dogfish because that's if you're going to dissect in dissections in college, they oftentimes will use dogfish as that. So I got to dissect a dogfish one time. So I thought that was interesting. They, as with other things too, we've talked about it before, where birds will hang out in an area where marine mammals are feeding and come in and take the fish and stuff. And the same thing, so birds can indicate feeding area. But what's interesting is that some minkies may actually target areas where diving birds have previously schooled the prey together.
Oh, it's like backwards.
I know, right? So instead of them
cool.
doing the work and the birds taking advantage, they do it the opposite.
I mean, that's what we would do with when I was on the whale watching boat, we would always look for the bird balls or the bird congregations first if we looking for minkies. And
well, yeah,
not,
and that's normal, right? Because you see those and you go, okay, there's something going on there, and then you get there. But that's again generally usually the marine mammals that are balling that bait ball up first, and then the birds are taking advantage of it. So I thought it was
so the minkies are actually doing what you guys were doing. I'm like, oh, there's a bunch of birds over there. I should go check out that spot. That's cool.
Cookies. Yeah, I thought that was really cool. So let's see, what else do I got here? We talked a little bit about that distribution, and it's interesting that there is some variation. The segregation and distribution of the northern hemisphere animals suggests a complex social and population structure, but of course we don't actually know much about it because these guys are hard to study, just because of their size and their behavior, and the locales of like Antarctica, which it's hard to study these animals in. But photo ID in our region, so some places migrate and some places don't. So like some of the individuals will migrate fairly large distances and other places will stay relatively in restricted areas. And they did some photo ID, the guys up in Canada, and there's another group here in Puget Sound that they did it, and they showed that some do migrate long distances, over 400 kilometers at a time. But then there are other ones in Puget Sound that have exclusive adjoining home ranges, which is unknown in other baleen whales. So they actually like have an area, that's where they stay. And that's not normal for baleen, right? Baleen whales, you migrate to one area and you do your thing, and you migrate to another area and you do your thing. You feed or you mate and give birth, whatever.
Have they seen minkies down in Seattle in the Puget Sound area? I assume so, because we always hear about them in the San Juans, but
yeah, I would assume so. And I think this one, when they said Puget Sound, I think they're talking about the Salish Sea, because it was the way it kind of used to be called, the Puget Sound, the whole thing. I don't know how far south they've been found.
I want to say I've heard of them in Hokanau before, but
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we saw one in Burroughs Pass the other day, like last year, so they can kind of go wherever. But I thought that was really interesting. It's really varied, even within a population, right? So the animals that are here, some migrate and some don't, it seems. They do basically, the main thing for most minkies is that the seasonal movements are much less predictable and much less well defined than most of the other baleen whale species, right? So again, they know here to go breed, then they go here to go feed, and it's at these time frames. And minkies are like, I don't subscribe to that. I want to do what I want.
I've yet to see a minkie calf too. I've seen plenty of minkies, but never.
I've never seen a minkie calf either. Well, and so that's interesting, is that we have not seen calves here in the summer, I believe. And in our region, they're loyal to these summer feeding grounds. They're here all the time for, in that time. But what I believe, when I was looking at that stuff, they've never seen mating in minkies. They don't know where the breeding or calving grounds are. And they think that the babies are with the mom for only 4 to 6 months, because they see the moms in the summers, but they don't see the calves.
Right. Because we were discussing that yesterday, and it's like, oh, good point. So they must like ditch the calves before they come up here, I guess, presumably, or
you're done.
Yeah, how interesting.
Yeah. And so they're sexually mature at 7 to 8 years old. Pregnancy is about 10 months, and then they can calve every 2 years on average, but some say that they might be able to calve every year. That I thought that was really interesting. That they're just like, yeah, all right, you're gone. No, I'm back to doing my own thing. Yeah, that's right.
Well, especially for a larger, for a larger whale species. Obviously they're the smaller ones of the baleen whales, but just it's interesting that there's that little time in between. Like a lot of times the weaning period is quite extensive for larger whales. So that's pretty interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, and then they do find does seem to be, again, those sex differences where females stay closer to shore and males are found farther out. There are some sex differences in migration as well in certain areas. So where the distribution is, where the animals go, is by sex. Females will go a certain area and males will go another. Yeah.
Can you tell the difference, just male versus female, based on observations?
I don't think so. Yeah, again, there's, okay, so maybe if you see them up at this certain latitude, maybe they're more likely to be females than males, but I don't think there would be a stark, like, oh, we've never seen a male above this area. Yeah. And I don't know physically, I don't think you can either. They're not sexually dimorphic. So that, yeah, so I mean, the main thing is, so there does seem to be a lot of variation in the populations and within populations about what they do and where they go. When they're diving, so they don't dive as long as other baleen whales. They only dive for about 6 to 12 minutes and maybe up to 15. But again, their food really isn't deep down, so they don't really have to do that. And I think that's most of my stuff there. Yeah, they're just really varied, and we really just don't know a lot about these guys. I think they're like porpoises in that they've kind of been not researched as much as other species because of the fact that they are hard to study and in certain areas hard to find, and they're just like to be left alone.
It's funny because I think there are a fair amount population wise.
Yeah,
oh,
I
yeah.
think
Well, I'll talk about that next, actually.
Yeah,
and obviously it's going to be different for different geographic areas, but that's one thing. One thing I want to note is the vocalizations.
Oh, I was going to talk about that.
Oh, okay. I won't then. But they have a lot of
Okay.
different vocalizations, and there's one that's really cool, and I'm sure Kat is going to talk about it.
Yeah, because that's one of the fun facts for my section. So
excellent. There you go.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just move into that. So their status, like Trevor was just saying, the minke whales, especially in the US, are not currently endangered or threatened, but they are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And because of that, they are, I guess not because of that, but as that, I guess, implies, they are actually the most abundant rorqual species in the world. So like Cindy mentioned earlier, they think that one of the reasons that may be is actually because they were kind of left alone for a long time, where a lot of the larger whale species weren't. And obviously they had that reduced competition for food resources at the time. They are currently, the International Whaling Commission does currently recognize 2 stocks in the North Pacific as being of concern. Okay. And these are basically 2 stocks that are in and around the Japan area and the Pacific waters in that region. And that is one of the locations where they are still currently whaled. So that kind of does make sense. And there are basically just a very small number of the eastern North Pacific animals, which is the west coast of the US. That always is a little confusing.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, eastern North Pacific.
So confusing.
West. Yeah. Oh, okay.
And that state, those animals are taken for subsistence by Alaskan peoples. So basically, they are now starting to question because, as you said, they're quite difficult to find and difficult to keep tabs on. They are now starting to question the current population estimates and wondering that maybe some stocks are actually a little more depleted than they thought because of the modern whaling and hunting efforts, but that's still an unknown factor. We're not sure yet about what that looks like. And that does tie in nicely to the threats for the minke whale. So whaling is obviously one of those threats. I believe that several thousand have been hunted in the Northern Hemisphere since the commercial whalers started targeting minkes, which is still relatively few when you think how many whales were taken back in the heyday of whaling. Right. But they have seen in the Southern Hemisphere that a few dwarf minkes were hunted as well.
They're really getting desperate if they're going for the smallest of the smallest, like
right. And I don't know if it's just because they're allowed to hunt minkes and they're not allowed to hunt several other whale species. So maybe it's just, this is what we can hunt. Yeah. So we can go for that. I'm not sure.
Let's deplete those stocks as well. Great. Yeah.
Right. Who knows? So currently the countries that are still whaling are countries such as Greenland, Japan, and Norway. I believe Iceland also might still be taking minke whales for both food and for the scientific research category of whaling. So there's that. Entanglement is also another main threat, as we mentioned with the sei whale as well. So typically that's in fishing gear. And because minkes are so widely distributed, they're really susceptible to many different types of gear. So anything that really involves lines is a potential problem. So they had listed groundfish trawls, gill nets, herring weirs, lobster traps, purse seine nets, like basically anything with a net attached that's drifting in the water column is a potential issue for minke whale entanglement. Ocean noise and vessel strikes are 2 other kind of threats that are becoming more and more spoken about, especially with the increase in shipping traffic, and because of these animals' very wide distribution. They are going to overlap with more fishing routes and have a potential for more noise exposure and for vessel strikes. And the noise exposure one is really interesting, which I'll talk about again in a second.
Yeah, no, I did a paper just came out about gray whales distribution, and they overlapped it with shipping lanes and stuff, showing how much more of an increase there is, and like we're like likely not seeing it probably because not all those animals come in. So it makes sense, especially with their kind of
extensive
cosmopolitan, their extensive
yes,
range.
Exactly.
They're going to be overlapping a lot of different shipping places.
Yeah. So in relation to the ocean noise, I was going to talk about this last actually, but since you already brought it up, the vocalizations of the minkies. So some of the ocean noise issue is actually due to not just that it might be disturbing to the animals, but also that it can really influence how well their vocalizations are heard by other whales.
Right.
So they have a vast array of sounds that they produce. These include, this is a really fun list that I found. So they include clicks, grunts, pulse trains, ratchets, thumps, and the really cool one that Cindy was mentioning is the boing. So all of these basically sound like exactly like the word would describe, right? So clicks are clicks and grunts sound like grunts. And these boings are literally, they were unknown sounds for the longest time, and people were picking them up on the hydrophones, and they're like, what on earth is this? Like,
it does not sound like it should be coming from an animal. Yeah.
No, it sounds like some weird space alien, like 1980s
like
movie.
Yeah,
it does.
Seriously.
It really does. It's gnarly. If we can find,
one.
I know we found a link to it somewhere. If we, maybe we can
I have a link.
I
I found one like on YouTube. I can put a link in the.
Okay, we'll put a link in the show notes then, because it's so weird. It's super cool. But obviously because of that, and because they do utilize a lot of the lower sound frequencies, that could be very problematic when you increase vessel noise in the ocean as well.
Right.
So some other fun facts: the scientific name for minke whales actually translates to the winged whale. So yeah.
I'm just doing wing.
Okay, I was like, sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
No.
So Balanoptera is the winged part, and then Acutorostrata is their second part, and that means sharp snout.
Right, because they do have that very pointy and
quite a pointy rostrum. Very cool. And then the name minke itself, the common name, actually comes from a Norwegian whaling spotter named Minke, who mistook a minke whale for a blue whale. So apparently it's probably like, oh, Minke's whale, because he always like, oh, pointing, making fun of that guy.
I know, and that's why I was like, well, okay, so he's a whale named after him, but it's kind of like not a nice thing, because
it's pretty derogatory, really.
Right, because it's like, dude, it's the second smallest baleen whale, and you mistook it for the largest animal on Earth. You
can just imagine, like back in the day in Norway, they're just like, oh, there's another Minke's whale. Must be a blue whale, right? Like,
those poor guys.
So minkies can live up to 50 years, as far as we know. And as Cindy mentioned, they have a relatively short dive time for some of the other rorqual species, but again, they typically don't need to forage further beneath the surface. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about too is just that, well, I guess the second last thing. So in relation to the dwarf minkies, again, just one other thing that I had found, Trevor, is just that they do also migrate pretty far seasonally. So that is something when you were talking about just the variation of migration. Apparently the dwarf minkies do actually travel pretty far distances, and it does seem to be a seasonal activity, which is kind of interesting. And then the last thing is in relation to predator response, which is super cool. So in the larger baleen whales, obviously orcas are their main predator. The mammal eating orcas are going to be the main source of problem for them. And pretty much all of the larger baleen whales have adapted to have a specific response to predators and predation. So in the minkies, they opt for the flight response. So they're really fast when they want to be. So they will basically just run away. If there's a threat, they will just run away. But the really fun thing that I learned when I was at university is that they basically ink before they run away.
Oh, that's right.
They release a fecal plume. So they're not actually inking. They're basically just, but it makes them quicker. Right. So it's literally like, what? Freak out. and they will just release a fecal plume and then race away from the predator. And so they think that it is actually twofold. It might be like a bird that typically relieves itself before taking flight. So it makes them a little bit speedier potentially, but also it could potentially confuse their predator enough and like cloud the sea behind them enough that they could maybe have a little bit of a smoke screen to get away.
Well, if you're a predator, I don't think you're thinking that somebody's going to poop in your face. So I think it would be a bit jarring.
A little bit. And in the ocean, it's going to disperse.
Yeah.
Like pretty quickly.
And it's going to be like this big cloud. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so anyway, that was always one of my favorite Minke stories. I'm like, I think that's the coolest thing ever.
That is super cool. And going when they go fast, I forgot to mention, when they go fast, they put up a spray. And again, similar to porpoises, where these guys do it so quickly that it comes up and it's kind of like a rooster tail with the speed. So like the Dall's porpoises, where they have that characteristic rooster tail splash.
Oh, cool.
So you might be able to see that.
Yeah. So that was all my fun facts for the Minkies.
The fun fact I'm going to add, which I think is just kind of cool. Somebody did a whale fall experiment in the North Sea. So they dropped a northern minke whale down 400 feet to the bottom, and they discovered a new species of tube worm on the carcass.
That are only on minkies?
And it was only on the minke. And it's one of those tube worms that attaches to the bone and then uses bacteria that specifically digest bone.
Right.
And that was a new species of worm that they discovered.
Wow, that is cool.
So that was my
if you guys want to go back to our whale fall episode to learn about that. But yeah, there's apparently these animals that are only found on certain species of whales when they fall.
A lot of bone boring worms, I think a lot of them are called. But yes, specific species are only found on specific whale species.
Yeah, which really I still just don't understand how that happens. Like, how do they find these random whale falls? It's pretty impressive. Well, the minke itself is, I was surprised at how much there really was for how much we actually still don't know about them. But there's still so many interesting things about these little small baleen whales. You never would have thought. Maybe because they're so inconspicuous, they have all these hidden treasures.
There you go. It's always they're the dark horse of the baleen whale world.
That's why they always have a little bit in my heart, because they're like the porpoises in that regards, and so I feel for them and I want to root for them. And so in here again, as I mentioned before, in the Salish Sea, they do have the photo ID that's going on, and we send our pictures whenever we happen to see a minke, we send it to them, and so that they're learning a lot more about our group here through that photo ID study and collaborating with people in Canada and stuff too. So there's some cool stuff going on for these inconspicuous, mysterious little whales. All right, so that is our Minke whale episode. Thank you guys so much for voting for the Minke.
Yeah, finally. See, aren't you glad that you did? Because there was so much to learn about Minke whales.
So much.
I think it won pretty easily this time. So that
it was like a landslide. Yeah. So that was really exciting to see. So keep an eye out on the next one. The beginning of the next month, we'll have another marine mammal highlight and have a poll out there for you guys. Next PacMam podcast episode will be, I think, likely another journal review. So we'll find an interesting one to check out. There's been some really cool stuff that's been coming out lately. So we'll pick a good one for that. And I think that's it. So have a great week or a couple weeks until we see you again. And we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.